All right, everyone, welcome. Welcome to this edition of Coffee and Containers. If this is your first time with us, this is a regular series to discuss various aspects of platform engineering, infrastructure as code, containers, Kubernetes, everyone's favorite stuff. Really, the goal of this series is to build a tight community of professionals who are really motivated to collaborate, share ideas and best practices, all in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. And I've got mine here ready to go as well. Sometimes I need two, so if you do see me step away, it's because these guys are talking too long. I need to go get another cup of coffee. If you do enjoy this content, I do encourage you to subscribe to this channel and stay updated with all of our regular content. We're releasing videos on about a weekly cadence right now. My name is Jim Scheltz. I'm the founder and president of North American DevOps Group, and I'm also a developer advocate at Shippa Corp. And I'm going to be moderating the discussion here today. And the topic for today is going to be microservices in the financial industry. We've got a couple of great panelists here lined up and thought leaders. Bruno Andrade, who's the founder and CEO of Shippa. He's been with us a couple of times already on this series. And then new to the series is Ken Owens. Ken is a VP of Cloud Native and Cybersecurity at Fiserv. I'm going to have the two of them introduce themselves as we start the discussion, just so we can keep things moving along here. So I am going to actually just jump straight into the first prompt, if that's okay. So the first prompt here for you guys is going to be, what is the role of microservices in cloud native that you see in the financial sector? And Ken, I know that's a pretty broad question, but maybe we can start with you. And again, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself as you get started here.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me. I have my my coffee also. And I hope we won't need a couple of refills, but we'll see how it goes. I do get long-winded sometimes, so you may have to cut me off. But I just joined Fiserv at the beginning of this year to lead the cyber security and cloud initiative. Before that, I was at MasterCard for a little bit over 3.5 years, leading up the cloud native engineering efforts at MasterCard. So when you think about financial services, it is a broad topic, Bruno, but the key, I think, that we've been learning in the financial services industry is that a lot of our use cases with credit card transactions, with securing transactions, the closer we can get to our merchants and to our banks and to our customers who are, the using of the cards, the better we can secure those transactions, the better we can get data quickly and securely from one, merchant to a bank and from a bank back to the merchant, and allow those packages to get, bought, or the groceries to get delivered, or the Uber Eats food to get, purchased and delivered. And however you look at it, right? There's a lot of interesting use cases in financial services around edge computing, around, serverless computing, around Kubernetes usage. And I think in the financial services markets, there's a lot of interest in containers and in containerization. I know the adoption is typically slower in financial services. A lot of financial service companies are older, more established companies that have a lot of compliance and regulatory pressures on us to kind of keep different types of security, different types of data treated differently than we would, public, movies or books or whatever you might be, purchasing food or whatever, right? So the information that's used to purchase all of that is a little bit more critical than the name of a movie that you're watching or what food you're ordering, right? And so there's a lot less, risk taking going on in the financial services market to throw everything into the cloud. But at the same time, we realize there are a lot of great use cases for cloud, and a lot of what I mentioned with the transaction processing and getting closer to the edge is probably the number one area that the financial services are looking at moving into Kubernetes and into the cloud for sure.
That's an awesome insight, and I think my question to you, based on that, especially you coming from from that security background now, is how do you see the bank seeing how microservices are structured today between open source and non-open source? Because today, if you see a lot of kind of Kubernetes and microservices, this has been heavily driven by open source, with maybe a minority of other tools being kind of closed source or commercial offerings. So I think two questions is how does the bank or financial services see that today in terms of risks versus kind of better approach? And the second question maybe related to that is, what's the type of application that you see being kind of the start service for kind of, well, let's start microservice. Let's see if Kubernetes works for us. What are some of the common approaches that you see there when people are starting?
Yeah, definitely, Bruno. For the first question, I like to kind of, say that there's a term in the industry that may be familiar to most people watching this. If not, it hopefully will be after I finish talking about it. But kind of best of breed is the term that's used a lot over the last couple of decades in the industry. And best of breed basically means that you don't want to you want to buy the solution that's going to give you the best solution in your environment. And so what's happening now with open source and financial services is that a lot of our traditional processes and traditional methods of how we secure an environment, which, the best way to kind of illustrate this is with an example. So you think about like firewall rules. We have a very strict process on how we approve access between different zones of an application deployment, whether it's an app trying to talk to a web tier or an app trying to talk to a database tier. There are multiple levels of security, and defense in depth is another term we use a lot in security, right? There's lots of layers of security to go through. And the perception in a lot of financial services industry is that people are the best ways of last line of defense to stop bad things from happening, right? And what that basically equates to is weeks of delay between the time you want to deploy something and the time you get the approval and the rules get put in place to allow you to do that. And as you know, and as your audience knows, that's not cloud native. That's not agile. That's not going to help, solve the kind of problems that we have to solve in the 21st century. And so trying to change that mindset, trying to change that mentality of people are not the last line of defense. People are a great line of defense and should be, defining roles and policies and responsibilities in code that then gets executed and validated by code that nothing is, inadvertently being deployed or being configured that shouldn't be allowed by policy, is something that we are moving towards, but it's a slow path to get there. So that's one example of where I think open source has a harder time of adoption, especially in financial services, because I've heard multiple times in financial services that you don't trust, your financial data to an open source project that has no security and no vendors sitting behind it to support it, right? And so what that has kind of caused, to kind of lead into your second part of your question, what that kind of leads into then is, how do we in the financial services industry deal with the rate of change that cloud native is bringing about? And what that kind of brings about is two different pieces. The first one is open source in general. How do we bring in open source programs to adopt open source technologies? How do we contribute back to the community? Kubernetes is an example in financial services that you're seeing banks and other financial services sector companies are getting involved and contributing code back to the community around security and around some of the functions and events that we need or that we have a lot of interest in around, data lakes and data security that is needed in these areas. We're putting a lot of time and resources to give back to the community. Some of that we are allowed to talk publicly about. Some of that we just join and contribute to as, members of the community without really making a lot of noise, because in the financial services market, you don't want to raise a lot of attention to yourself, right? And say, what we're doing, because then that puts a big, bullseye on whatever project you're contributing to. And that's something we don't really want. We don't want extra. We have enough attention as it is. We don't need to add extra attention to us. And so going down that path, right, the first area that I think you're seeing in financial services is adopting Kubernetes type of infrastructure is sort of taking a combination of solutions that are in the marketplace by vendors that we work with on a regular basis, whether it's, Red Hat or whether it's Pivotal Cloud Foundry, kind of taking what I like to call kind of your first introductory step into this environment by leveraging a solution from a vendor that you work with for other parts of your business. But you also have that that they're using open source Kubernetes, and you're not taking advantage of any of the special sauce that vendor has built around their distribution of Kubernetes. You're trying to keep it as close to the raw Kubernetes bits and some of the pieces that come in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation ecosystem of products and services around those bits. That you're really trying to sort of isolate yourself from whatever vendor solution is being developed and leverage the open source counterpart of that, which is also supported by your vendor. So it's kind of a fine line to walk there. And the type of application that we're very interested in right now in financial services is that transaction processing use case, where we are trying to get as close to our merchants and our banks as we can in the public cloud securely over private network connectivity to decrease the amount of latency between those transactions that are happening at the edge of the network. And so there's a lot of attention in the financial services market right now around how do we get as close to the edge as we can, and that's where a lot of our attention has been in developing applications that are at the edge.
Nice. No, makes sense. Thanks a lot for that.
So yeah, thank you, Ken, for that response. And I want to move on to the next prompt, and maybe Bruno, I can start with you on this one, if you wouldn't mind just doing a quick intro of yourself as well. But Ken touched on a little bit of this already, right? Which is, I wanted to ask about the adoption of microservices and Kubernetes in the financial sector, and kind of where that is on the scale right now, from immature to highly mature. And Bruno, I know you talk with a lot of these companies, right? And people that are facing a lot of the challenges that they're trying to use cloud native and microservices and Kubernetes to overcome. But just off the top of your head, where would you kind of put those companies on that scale today?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for having me on Coffee and Containers again, Jim. As Jim mentioned, I'm one of the founding members here at Chipa, and I'm sure Ken has a lot better insight than me on this one. But and feel free to correct if I say anything wrong that you see differently, Ken. But I
think it'll be interesting to hear where you see it, right, from the outside, and where it is on the inside.
It makes sense, and a lot of discussions that we have with the financial services firms out there today is they started the journey. They understand what Kubernetes and microservices are. They started doing the first few migrations, and they started with I would say maybe call it satellite projects. And as they start now rolling out Kubernetes across the whole company, we see a lot of these folks having trouble, right? And then the trouble starts happening when there's a lack of workflow, especially when you talk between what are the roles of the developers versus the DevOps/platform engineering team, the infrastructure and the security team. So there's no kind of centralized workflow there, and there are a lot of impacts, especially as you see the organizations try to scale up across multiple clusters, or maybe different clouds or different applications, and then different teams responsible for them. And I see a lot of financial services trying different approaches and different tools to try and kind of fix that problem, but it's still an open problem, especially when you talk about the developer experience now starts going down, and being a heavily regulated industry, enforcing policies and security across kind of wide range of clusters and teams and so on becomes a challenge. So at least from my perspective, that's where I see in conversations, I see a lot of them. Okay, microservices, it works for us. Kubernetes is a great technology, we got to go. But now it's time for us to structure the process to make sure that we can attend that growth. At least from my conversations, that's the feeling I get from most of them.
How close is he, Ken?
I'd say you're spot on, Bruno. The only additional points I would make is I think that process piece is really underutilized today in discussions, right? There's a lot of gaps today in how a traditional process for deployment is performed versus what we want to be doing as we move into a Kubernetes model and looking at containers. I just a couple of weeks ago had a discussion about putting agents on containers, which I laughed at the guy and told him, no, we're not putting agents on containers. It's just the mindset is, this is how we've always done it. Let's just continue that. And I think from a, from an industry standpoint, financial services, you have two groups in our industry. You have the guys that I guess are kind of like me that are pushing forward and saying, let's transform, let's do things differently. Let's take the lessons we've learned in the past and apply them to what we need to do going forward. Let's not, I don't want to lose the knowledge and the experience that we've gained in multiple decades of financial services operations, right? So we don't want to lose that knowledge and that skill set. But at the same time, the problems that we're trying to solve today are not the same problems we had a decade ago or even 3 years ago for that matter, right? And so we have a new set of problems that we need to solve. We need to take the lessons we've learned from the past and apply them going forward. So that's, one thing I'll add to what Bruno mentioned. The other thing is just in general, the adoption is, I like to kind of call it the turtle versus the hare, right? We're sort of, we're kind of like tortoises. We're on our way. We're going to keep moving forward, and we're going to take a few applications into the cloud. And then we may kind of pause for a couple of weeks or months to kind of figure out why things didn't work the way we thought they would. And then we'll take, 4 or 5 more applications to the cloud, and then we'll probably pause again and kind of make sure that things are going right and we're not getting hacked and we're not having lots of issues with data leakage and other issues that we are concerned about in this industry, right? And then we'll keep moving forward. And so in the end, I don't know if we will win any races. I don't know if this is really a race to cloud native or not, but I think financial services is, to answer your question, is kind of on a slow and steady pace to make sure that we are trusting but verifying that we're moving forward in the right way, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And when as you move forward and you start bringing more applications, one question that I have is, do you see what happened with a lot of the VMs, kind of VM sprawl at that time, right? That everybody started kind of spinning up a VM and deploying their apps. And to your point that should I put an agent inside a container, you kind of see the mentality back there. So do you see that happening as well, but maybe a container or a microservices sprawl across the financial services or across the firm where people are just spinning up their clusters, deploying whatever they want? Do you see that happening, and do you see challenges kind of around enforcing controls over that?
No, that's a really good point, Bruno. And there's a couple of really interesting aspects I've seen there. The first one is just I've had this discussion with probably over the last decade. I probably had this discussion 100 times with financial services companies, right? A CMDB does not do me any good in a microservices world because it scans the infrastructure once a week, right? I could have millions of containers spin up and spin down in a week. And so why would I waste my time updating a CMDB with a container that's going to be gone in 10 seconds or less, if even that, right? And so, so it's a very good point that there are traditional models and traditional controls need to be looked at differently. The security is still the same level of security. We don't want to spin up a container that hasn't been, we want to kind of have the, something that tells us that this is a trusted container. We want to have something we can check at deployment time that, we're not deploying something that has been tampered with. We want to make sure that in runtime that we're able to sort of, even if it's just for a few milliseconds, we want to make sure that everything that's going in and out of that container is being secured and validated and that nothing is leaking that shouldn't be leaking, right? And so there are ways to do that in container space, but it's not the same tooling to your point, right? It's a different set of tooling. And the last piece I think is really interesting here that you brought up, a lot of the methodologies around how we want to deploy in a containerized model. It really goes back to, how you think about deployments in general, right? How does your application team do their development? How do they ensure that they're developing code in a secure way? Whether you call it DevOps, Sec DevOps, shift left is a lot of the terms I hear in the financial services industry, right? I think you start left. You don't shift anywhere. You just start in the right place, develop it correctly from the beginning, right? And then you don't have to worry about it. And so that's sort of in general how I look at that question. One thing about the sprawl piece that I can point to is while I truly believe you're right that there will be container sprawl, I have not seen that yet. And I think what I'm seeing, which is a little bit of a different problem, is containers are meant to be temporary, right? They're meant to be kind of spun up, run whatever services you need, and then they spin themselves down. As I kind of mentioned before, in the financial services industry, we're doing transactions, right? And so for us, that should be a very simple model. When a credit card is swiped or entered into a website, all of that should kick off containers to do whatever processing needs to be done to secure and perform that transaction. Instead, we leave the containers up and running 24/7, 365, right? We don't want to spin them up and down. And I think that's where, I always joke that cloud isn't cheaper than traditional infrastructure for that reason, right? If you're running you're running your infrastructure in someone else's environment, and you're paying for them to host that environment, and you're paying for every bit and byte that leaves that environment, you're going to pay more than in a data center because you don't own that hardware. You don't own that plant. You don't own the utility, if you will, of that service. And so you don't do cloud for cheapness. You do cloud for more agility, better reach. There's lots of reasons to do cloud.
True.
Not necessarily for cost savings, especially if you're going to keep your infrastructure up and running 24/7 by 365, which I hope is a problem we solve in this industry. Bruno, I don't want to I'm not a proponent of doing it that way. I do think we should be more, ephemeral and up and down a lot, quicker. But I think the issue there goes back to what you and I just talked about, right? The lack of agents, the lack of traditional ways of doing things, I think scares, traditional developers and traditional platform teams, which I think you kind of brought this up earlier too, is also kind of another issue, I think, in our industry that we have to have so many different teams, right? You have to have a dev team, you have to have a DevOps team, you have to have a platform team, you have to have a, network team, you have to have a security team. There's so many different teams that all have to be involved in this that I think until we can really sort of automate this all completely as a software as a service type of model, I'm not sure we're going to be able to solve all of these problems until then.
It makes sense. It makes sense. And one point that you brought is changing the mentality of folks in the way that we've been doing it forever. And one question that I have for you is not only financial services, but my experience with enterprises in general, right? When you implement something, for you to roll out an upgrade or roll out a new version, this takes like a year because if we go back to our times at Oracle, for example, that you would have a major release once a year, and then kind of the entire team was prepared to do that. But Kubernetes, I know it's been there for 5-6 years now, but you see a new release every quarter, right? And then there's new stuff coming up. How do you see that? Do you think that scares the DevOps or the platform engineering team with the pace of change? And how do you see that being maybe a point of concern for folks as they try to scale their utilization of Kubernetes in the financial sector?
Yeah, Bruno, that's definitely a very good point, and another one that I've seen, just like you, over the years. I think back in the earlier days before we had such rapid changes, right? And once a year, twice a year. I always kind of talk about how at a lot of the companies I've worked at, our life cycle for hardware was 7 years if we could get it, right? Yeah. For software, it was at least 5 years, if not, if we couldn't do more, right? We always try to do more, and there's still Windows 95 servers are in lots of environments. I've talked to people over the last couple of years, right? So it's still a lot of legacy infrastructure out there. Yeah, And to your point, I think that is one of the reasons that there is a concern in this environment today, is that if you look at just the rate of change, so even if you could adjust to support a new Kubernetes release every quarter, it's not just Kubernetes, right? You have your monitoring solution is dependent on that new version of Kubernetes. Yeah. In some cases, like we had an outage at my previous company because there was an update to an object store under the covers that ended up affecting Harbor that wasn't even part of the deployment of the application, but it took down the entire application deployment model because Harbor was no longer able to do its job with underneath object storage issues, right? And so there's dependencies upon dependencies, and there's so many different, branches that go off of those dependencies that have other dependencies that you don't even know about until something happens, right? I think there's an acknowledgement that it's very complex, and I think just that acknowledgement, even without trying to figure out why it's complex, I think there's just an acknowledgement that it's too complex, and because of that, we need to have controls that we are comfortable with, right? And I think that's a mentality that you're going to see change as we get better visibility tools out there. We get better tracing and understanding of what's dependent on what. I think that will get better. That's where that CMDB discussion most recently came into play, was trying to understand the dependencies by leveraging the CMDB. They could then kind of correlate all the different dependencies. And some of the solutions that we're looking at in the public cloud space have the ability to kind of help you identify where all of your different dependencies are in your software stack. And so tools will keep getting better. But like you and I've talked about before offline, right? The technology is always going to solve problems. It's really the people and the process that you have to focus on.
I agree.
Without fixing the people and the process models, right? Your technology is just going to take a bad process forward, and that's not what you want to do with a new technology.
I agree. That's awesome.
Well, this is a perfect segue, Ken. Thank you for that, to our final prompt here, which is all around the culture in microservices and Kubernetes, right? And let's talk about that specifically from a financial industry perspective. When I talk to people regarding their DevOps transformations, I would say 9 times out of 10, the culture aspect is kind of the first thing that they say is the biggest challenge for them. Automating things, leveraging technology and stuff, that's easy at a microscopic level. But then as you start to spread that out throughout the organization, then it's how do we get everyone marching to the same beat of the drum? How do we you mentioned all these different roles, right? DevOps people, platform teams, developers. How do we prevent those roles from being blurred when we're really looking at that, right? And getting people to understand what their role is, how they leverage microservices, how this is benefiting the company. And maybe, Ken, we can start with you on this one. How do you kind of tackle the culture aspect of things when it comes to microservices and Kubernetes and financial?
Yeah, definitely. So the approach that I've taken successfully for a couple of companies now is just sort of taking a head-on approach that we need to make these changes. There are a couple of ways to go about making that change that we'll probably get into, as we go through this part of the discussion. But I think in general, right, you have to acknowledge and get your leadership to acknowledge that there is a culture change that's needed. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to let go of people, right? There will always be operation jobs, I think, in the industry. I don't see a time when we still have mainframes everywhere, right? So I don't see a time when we're going to have no need for operational roles, and for people who don't understand DevOps, right? I think that's going to always have a role for them. But I do believe if you challenge engineers and operations guys to do something new, to learn new technology, if you help them understand how this will help advance their career, how this will make their jobs, a little bit less hectic. I like to use the word churn, right? Help get rid of the churn that they have to deal with every day, and give them more of an interesting, exciting role of helping to, solve business problems and business challenges that they maybe haven't been aware of because they've been too busy in the churn that gets created in the underlying infrastructure and issues that happen there. So that's kind of how I've approached it. Like I said, I'm sure there's other things we want to get into, but I thought I'd just kind of start with that approach, and then have Bruno maybe add in some things he's seen as well.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I think it's classic at this point when it comes to Kubernetes is the blurred line between the developers and the DevOps / the platform engineering team, right? Where DevOps now, I see, or the developers, sorry, I see a lot of them being dragged into the infrastructure layer level, where they have to understand what microservices are, what Kubernetes actually is, and when I'm deploying my code, I'm no longer deploying my code anymore. I now have to learn how to create a deployment set, an ingress rule, how to create this, and that. So you see the blurry line between the developer and the DevOps, and you see that discussion on, it's the developer's job to now learn Kubernetes. And while I see learning is value, right? Learning is power, and it's always great to learn new things. I think there's got to be define roles and responsibilities across the organization in a way that you are not pushing burden into a team that they shouldn't see, right? And I was talking to a company last week, and the guy was on the DevOps side of the fence, and then we started that discussion, and he brought an interesting point. He was like, well, I get it's nice for the developers to learn a little bit of Kubernetes, but the thing is, they shouldn't learn it. They shouldn't be concerned about it. They should deploy their application code. And I get why sometimes they get so mad with Kubernetes and stuff like that, because at the end of the day, a lot of the DevOps team try to push them to learn and maintain that stuff. But being honest is, I don't go read a Java book on my free time just because I support a Java application, right? That's not my responsibility. In the same way, I can't expect that on their free time, instead of being with family and doing whatever they want, they're going to be reading a Kubernetes, how to run Kubernetes book, right? So I think it blurred the line a lot. And I think the way, as we start kind of scaling the Kubernetes adoption, is implementing the right workflows, right? And who is responsible for what, and using Kubernetes as it should be used as a technology, but on the background. Today, and the example I use to that is when I'm deploying my code on a VM on Amazon, I don't care if Amazon is running KVM or if Amazon is running Hyper-V, what type of parameter they are running on the kernel. Of course, there are always kind of edge cases and specific scenarios that you have to know, but I would say maybe 90% of your time, you just don't care. You deploy your application code. So I think as we start scaling Kubernetes, we have to start implementing some workflows, roles, and responsibilities in a way that everyone focuses on what they need to focus. At least that's the mentality I have or thought today.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that, Bruno, quite a bit. Some insight that may help with that view that I've been kind of looking at lately is it's almost like a chicken and egg problem for us, because the reason that developers have to know so much about Kubernetes today in financial services is because the platform team hasn't provided them an environment that they can just deploy their code to and not have to understand the underlying infrastructure yet, right? Or the platform capabilities yet. And so in a way, it's a problem that's sort of caused by, just like we talked about before, open source moves so fast, industry is moving so fast. Developers are like, hey, this is really cool, I should be using this. And they get Docker, running on the development laptop, and they start doing some development in Kubernetes and Docker on their laptop. And they're like, oh, this is cool stuff. Look at how I can do with this. Not realizing that the laptop doesn't represent a global server environment that needs to be centrally secured and managed and supported, and products that are going to be consumed by consumers that need high reliability and high security around that deployment, right? And so it's one of these areas that you're absolutely right. If we want those developers focusing on what they do best, which is like building that code and making that code experience for our customers the best it can be, right? We want a platform team to kind of understand how to interface to the development team, and that's where I think some of the discussions that I've been having a lot lately have to come back to whatever you want to call the direction the industry is going to go. You still need a developer capability or a developer role, right? You still need a operational role, and you still need an infrastructure/platform role, right? However you want to look at that in the industry, you need to sort of have these three different groups of contributors need to have a set of what do you want to call them? YAML files or Golang, files, whatever it is. They need to have their own little specifications that they work within. And there needs to be SLAs between the three of them, so that when a developer wants to deploy their code, they have to provide some information about what type of network concerns they have, right? Not what networks or what IP addresses they need, right? But that they need to be able to connect to a database. They need the database to be able to get access to
True.
to host this type of data, right? They want to make sure that there's no public access to that database, right? That database contains some type of classification of data that means it can't be open to the public, right? Now, you might say, well, isn't that the case for all databases? It might be, but there might be other cases where we have partners or a way to share information that we're using a different type of database for that type of information that may be of a public classification that we can share publicly, right? So it really depends on, what that, I like to call that interface, right? What does that human machine interface need to look like for the application teams to say, here's what they need, for the operations teams to kind of say, here's how we support that, and for the platform team to say, here's how we deploy it and here's how we manage and support it, right? And that interface has been discussed in a couple of ways. I know Shipper has a lot of good, software around this space as well. There's a, open application model, sort of a spec that I've been looking at a lot in the industry. And there are other, each cloud provider has their own way of defining sort of their specifications, and each platform provider has their own way of specifying the sorts of specifications, right? So there's a lot of, information out there about this, but I think there hasn't really been a good, strong rallying point, or even like recognition that you need to sort of define these 3 different or 4 different roles, if you need 4 roles, right? And how that interface between them needs to be supported.
I think you're completely right, and you hit the nail on the head, because I think so far, and that's because the industry, or not the industry, but the technology is new, right? And what we see a lot of conversations with financial services folks as well is that they start with Kubernetes, and there has been a lot of focus on Kubernetes as a technology, right? Because it's complex, it's hard to operate, and all these things that we all know. And people have been concerned around, how do I upgrade my cluster? How do I implement this? How do I implement my ingress controller? And so on and so forth. And a lot of the market, even around kind of the ecosystem when it comes to startups and other vendors, they have been focused a lot on how to solve the Kubernetes cluster management problem. But at least the way I see that is, great. There is still complexity. There is still points for improvement, but now everybody understands Kubernetes at a decent level, or most folks understand Kubernetes at a decent level that they can operate, and there are tools to help them out with that. But as they start scaling, now they notice that, okay, my cluster is no longer my problem. Now my problem is my application, right? So how do I properly deploy my application? How do I define the roles and the services that I need to deploy my application? And another big question that I see from them is, great, I managed to kind of come out with a way of deploying my app, but post-deployment, nobody really understands the application. My developers cannot support. So I think over 2021 and moving forward, the focus should shift a lot to the application deployment and management post-deployment, because you see a lot of CI/CD talks, but what happens post-deployment, nobody really talks about it, and it becomes hard. And on some financial services, we see some folks trying to build a platform on top of Kubernetes to do that. And while it's great because everyone preaches, well, Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms, and I agree to a certain extent, but it's not the financial services' main role to build a platform to be able to operate their applications. And you see a lot of folks struggling a lot with that. Do you see that as well?
I do, yeah. And you're right. It's definitely not our role. It's not the business that we want to be in. And I think this kind of goes to the point I made a little bit earlier, right? That I said we'd come back to, right? There's a role that most everyone in financial services and in the enterprise space has as we move to Kubernetes, and a lot of that is, how do you kind of take what you do today and codify it, and then how do you take some of, like, to your point, right? How do you make this a true software defined infrastructure, right? Not just say you have, your code in Git for your firewall, right? That's not a good model, right? You have to have the entire life cycle around, how do you update it? How do you maintain it? How do you support it? How do changes get brought in, right? If an application team wants to do something that's never been done before, how do you allow them to do that securely and safely in a lower environment, and then add that capability and add that role to your code in a secure way that allows them to move to production quickly once they have everything validated and tested in the lower environment? How do you have the right validation built in to your infrastructure code to ensure that as you're deploying or as you're updating your infrastructure code, you're not breaking something that you're dependent on or that another team is dependent on, right? We saw this a lot, as you remember, in the early days of cloud with API calls, right? Because cloud providers change that API all the time. And so if you hard coded that API, you were stuck anytime the cloud provider did an update that modified that API call in any way. And so the answer, as you know, isn't to just never change your APIs. It's to write that abstraction layer so that you're validating that API before you send something to it. And if it changes, you know it's changed, and you fix it before someone else calls that API and breaks it.
I agree.
So it's a different mindset, but it's not that. What I like to tell a lot of my discussions with DevOps teams on infrastructure and in the development space is that this isn't really different than how they do it today. It's just you're putting code around what you mentally think about and mentally try to do today, right? You're trying to capture what your process and what your thoughts are in code, and then you're trying to write some validation to ensure that because like what happens as you know, what happens with human error is that you want to make a change on something, you log in, you type in a command. Once you hit enter, that command is entered, and it takes effect immediately. So if you fat finger something, you immediately see a problem, right? With code, you have the ability to actually capture that mistake before it's made. If you type in the wrong information in the code should validate that this information is wrong and kick it back to you and say, you have the wrong input parameter here, change this. And then you don't make that mistake in the first place, right? And so if they think about it from the standpoint of this is a process improvement to how they do things today, it's not taking them out of the equation. It's actually giving them more ability to focus on what matters more to the business, right? To your point, don't focus on the toil that we have to focus on today with running a platform. Let's provide a platform and then focus on how do we enhance it? How do we make it faster? How do we make it better? How do we make that experience to our customers so great that they don't ever want to leave us, right? That's the focus we should have, not on what does Kubernetes 13.6 give me next quarter when it comes out, right? That's the wrong thing for a platform team to be looking at. They should be looking at what our customers need and how the technology can enable that versus the other way around.
I completely agree. And one thing I always tell people is as much as Kubernetes is nice and all, and I see some folks saying, we want to make Kubernetes boring. You don't have to make Kubernetes boring. You have to make Kubernetes disappear, right? And you just said a great point that when I access the website and I'm consuming the application that you provide me as an end customer, I don't care if you're running on Kubernetes, if you're running even on mainframe, as long as the application works for me, that's the best point, right? So I think there is the shift that we got to start focusing on the app rather than on the kind of back-end technology itself.
Definitely. I completely agree.
You might care if it's still running on Windows 95.
That's a different discussion.
Well, guys,
I you're looking for.
Yeah, well, to that point too, somebody said this at one of our events a few years ago that made the point that you need to let your rules define the tools. Don't let the tools define your rules. So hardly agree with that, right? Figure out what you guys need, and then you go find the solutions that you need to make that work. And don't go find the new shiny thing and start to try to cram all of your processes and applications into that new shiny thing. I think this is a great conversation, by the way. Thank you both for being on here to do this today. I think we could go on for at least 2 or 3 cups of coffee. Unfortunately, I only brought one. So before we sign off, though, I'd like to ask both of you if you have any final thoughts for our viewers. And Bruno, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think from in terms of thoughts, I would like to close is exactly that, right? Focus on the application. Not the technology itself, but as you move and as you scale and as you adopt this new technology because it makes sense for your application, start thinking about a workflow, how to structure things around and how to build in a process that you can make sure everyone is involved at the right time, and everyone is responsible for what they should be. So you can drive efficiency within the organization, but treat the application as a first-class citizen in your organization rather than the cool new toy, I would say.
Awesome. And Ken, any final thoughts for our viewers here today?
Yeah, just to kind of add to what Bruno was saying, what I've had success with is sort of looking at what I kind of call a service design methodology. I kind of feel like the application teams and the platform teams need to work very closely together in the very early kind of experimental phases, if you will, of a new deployment or a new way of addressing a deployment or a new technology adoption, right? That if those two teams would have like a sandbox that they can play in together, what you have is the best of what we've talked about here. You have the platform team learning from the app team, the app team learning how to not worry about the underlying infrastructure and platform capabilities. And in the end, you get an experience that the application teams love, the platform team loves, and your customers would just be excited that they have, that type of an experience provided to them because the other two teams are so happy with the experience, right? And so everyone wins in that type of a model. It shouldn't be a lot of times you hear it's us against them type of mentality, right? And it needs to be more of a let's collaborate, let's work together. And then as we deploy towards production, the platform team goes into the background and the application team goes more into the forefront, which is how it should be.
I agree.
Great points. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, guys. We're at the end of our time here. Ken, I love the start left comment that you made. I'm going to steal that from you and use that.
No worries. You're welcome to it.
That's excellent. Well, thank you, guys. This was a really great conversation. And I'll include some relevant links in the description of the video for anyone who's watching this as well. And with that, it's time for the refill. So we're going to see all of you on the next Coffee and Containers. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ken, Bruno, for being here today.
Everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers. Cheers.